Let me know when you're ready.
Okay, I think everybody's in and we are recording.
All righty. Good morning, Robin. Good morning, Stronix. And good morning, Cindy. Welcome. My name is Heather Harlan, and I'm coming to you from Columbia, Missouri. Thank you to the Jacksonville Public Library for allowing me to be part of their summer reading program. Considering that the 4th of July is coming up in just a few days, because today's the 30th of June, it seems too good to open with a good standby favorite. I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy, a Yankee Doodle do or die, a real life nephew of my Uncle Sam, born on the 4th of July. I've got a Yankee Doodle sweetheart, she's my Yankee Doodle joy. Yankee Doodle came to London just to ride the ponies. I am a Yankee Doodle, I am a Yankee Doodle, I am a Yankee Doodle boy. So good morning, at least here in Missouri, it's a good morning. So how are you doing today? Again, considering it's the 4th of July, I've got a couple of special stories to tell you. Actually, that are about strong girls and women today that have to do with American history. The first one I'd like to tell you is based on a true story that happened in Massachusetts. This story is called An Army of Two. In 1811, in Scituate, Massachusetts, it was the beginnings of the rumblings of the War of 1812. Now, you might remember that only about 30 years earlier, the colonies had declared their freedom and had a revolution and a long war to get out from under the control of the British Empire. Now, Britain was ruled by a king, and it was a new idea to have a group of people stand up and declare we can govern ourselves. And we should be able to have leaders every few years, not just a king that rules for a long time. We believe we can figure out a way to change leaders peacefully. But England was still trying to get the states to come back and be part of England, and a war began, and it was brewing. And in 1811 in Scituate, Massachusetts, an English warship sailed into the American harbor there and set fire to 10 of the ships in their harbor. 10 ships filled with grain and fish and livestock and things that the citizens had created that they were going to sell to make a living. The citizens of Scituate were so angry, and they said, never again are the British going to sneak up on us. We are going to build a lighthouse so that we can see. And they formed a militia, which is a group of locally trained soldiers and citizens who were ready to defend their town. And so they knew if they saw the English coming again, they would be ready to defend their town and their ships. Well, that was 1811. They built, the town pooled together, and they built this beautiful lighthouse. Then the question came, well, who's going to be in the lighthouse? Who's going to take care of it? Who's going to watch and protect our town? Well, it wasn't long before they made the decision. It would be Simon Bates. Simon had been a captain and was a man of integrity, great loyalty, and courage. So Simon and his wife and 2 daughters moved into this beautiful new lighthouse and began their careful watch. The light circling warned ships of the rocky coast there in Scituate. And every so often, the militia would send, in fact, quite often, would send soldiers to help keep watch, to be sure that everyone was on the alert so the English couldn't sneak up on them again as they had a few years earlier. One of the The militiamen played the drum. And one played a fife, which is like a little flute. We'll see if I can play one, but his favorite tune was, can you guess it? Of course, Yankee Doodle. Well, Captain Bates's daughters were Abigail, the oldest. She was known as Nabby, was her nickname. And the younger was Rebecca, known as Becky. They watched the soldiers play those instruments. They said, would you teach us how to play? And the soldier said, sure. So one taught Nabby how to play the fife. And the other taught Becky, the younger, to play the drum. And he said, let's teach you how to play the call to arms. And she said, the call to arms? He said, yes. The reason that you have drums in the battle is sometimes it's so smoky and loud, the soldiers can't hear what the orders are. But the drums, you drum out the order. And when you hear the particular signal, the call to arms, that's a signal for everyone who could hear it together to defend themselves against the enemy. Oh, teach me the call to arms, teach me the call to arms, said Becky. So he did. He said, I have to play it loud and confidently. She said, okay. And she took it. No, try again. She got it. So they both practiced as often as they could. Nabby on the fife and Becky on the drum. Well, that was 1811. They built a lighthouse. 1814, in the fall of 1814, no one had seen a British ship for years. They had watched the harbor carefully, and it was time for the harvest. And so the men and the boys wanted, as usual in those days, to go work on the harvest farther inland. And the women were getting ready, and they took lunch to the workers in the field, as happened in those days. There was hardly anyone left in the village. And before she had left, Nabby and Becky's mother said, now girls, you be sure to go up to the top, go all the way up the circular stairs to the lighthouse and scrub the floor up there. It needs to be done. Yes, Mama, they said. Everyone in the village, there's hardly anyone left. They'd all gone to the fields. So Becky and Nabby were scrubbing. You could, the whole area around the lighthouse and the area around the upper floor smelled like soap and water. And they were scrubbing the floor. And Nabby, just to take a break, stood up and she grabbed the telescope off the ledge in the window and held it up and looked out on the horizon. She couldn't believe her eyes. She looked again. Becky, she said, they're coming. Becky said, what do you mean they're coming? Get back to work. They're coming. There's a British ship out there. Becky grabbed the telescope from her sister and said, where? Oh, they are. What did they see? Well, they looked, when you look far out over water, there's a horizon, that line where the sky meets the water. And there on that horizon, they saw coming up over the edge of the horizon an English flag. And under that flag was a ship, and it was getting closer and closer and closer to Scituate. Well, what do we do? What do we do? The girls looked at each other. I don't know, said Nabby. Everybody's in the fields. There's nobody. There's hardly anybody in the village. No one can help us. Becky said, and there isn't time to go get help. What do we do? We should scare them, said Nabby. Becky said, Nabby, that's silly. How are we going to scare them? You can't just say boo to a whole ship full of British sailors. Nabby thought for a while and she said, I have an idea. Come on, quick. And she grabbed her with her sudsy hand. She grabbed her sister by the hand, and they went all the way down that circular staircase. And as they ran out the door, Abigail grabbed up the fife and the drum. They took off and they went and they hid behind a barn that was right at the edge of the harbor. Both girls peeked out from behind that barn and they could see, they were close enough, they could see that ship now was close to the harbor, and they were lowering a boat, and on was climbing a bunch of sailors with red coats. And they watched carefully, and that boat sailed closer and closer to their harbor. All right, here's what we're gonna do, said Nabby. Becky, you play the drum. Play the drum? Why? Play the call to arms. Oh, we're gonna make him think that the soldiers are coming. Play the call to arms, said Nabby. Okay. All right. And Becky started playing the call to arms. Her sister began to play the fife. Boy, she had a hard time playing. And the girls peeked out from behind the barn. Now, if you've ever been on the edge of open water, you'll know that sound carries very easily. The sound of that drum and the sound of the fife carried all the way to that little boat into the ship. And they could hear the sailors talking to each other. They heard the captain say, "Halt!" And the soldiers stopped rowing. "What is it, Captain?" "They're playing the call to arms." "They're playing the call to arms." "Yes, sir," they said. "We didn't think anyone would be here today. We have enough soldiers to burn their ships, but we don't have enough soldiers to fight the whole militia. I don't like the feel of this. I think we're running into a trap." "Becky, play again." They played the drum and they played the fife. And finally, they heard the captain say, "I don't think this is a good idea at all." And about that time, they heard a big boom from the cannon on the ship, and that was the signal that they were to come back to the ship. The captain on the ship had heard the call to arms and the fife too. So they turned that boat around while Nabby and Becky watched, and that little boat sailed back out to the ship. The sailors climbed on. They pulled up their little boat. They turned that ship around, and as Nabby and Becky watched, that ship sailed out of the harbor. They watched until finally that flag disappeared behind the horizon. The British had left their town alone. And to this very day in Scituate, Massachusetts, there's a plaque in White House, or in the lighthouse there, to Abigail and Rebecca Bates, who defeated the British in Scituate, Massachusetts, with a fife and a drum. And that's the story of the Army of Two. Now I'd like to offer to you another story. It's a little bit longer today, but it's about one of my favorite people in American history. Annie Oakley. First, there's a song that you're going to need to learn. And you have to be able to clap your hands. one time, there'd be a point where I hit the guitar in the song and you clap your hands together right at that point. You'll get the hang of it. You ready? Annie Oakley, she was Little Miss Sure Shot. Try that. Annie Oakley, she was Little Miss Sure Shot. Annie Oakley, she was Little Miss Sure Shot. Annie Oakley, she lived a life others just could not. You got that? All right, just watch carefully. We'll do it one more time so that you're ready, because we're going to do this through the story. You ready? Okay, get that nice loud single clap with me, all right? Because I can't clap and play the guitar at the same time. Annie Oakley, she was Little Miss Sure Shot. Annie Oakley, she lived a life others just could not. All right. Well, this story takes place on October 4th, 1913. It was early morning. It was a cold, cool fall morning. Millie, a little girl who lived in Marion, Illinois, woke up. And I want to show you. I made a little map for you so you can see. All right, this isn't the best, but you can sort of see a little bit about where things are. All right, this is the state of Illinois right here. And this is Jacksonville, where the library is that is making possible this program. This is Chicago, way up there. A lot of you probably heard of Chicago. And this is St. Louis. A lot of people have been to St. Louis and know where that is. I wanted you to see where Columbia is. I'm in Missouri right here, so this is where I am. And our story today takes place in Marion, Illinois. So I wanted you to see where everything was. Marion, Illinois is where the story is. And it's in a place in Williamson County. So Millie woke up. She and her mother lived in Marion, Illinois. It was in Williamson County. The bed felt nice and warm, but oh, she smelled bacon cooking. And then she remembered, today's the day. She threw back the covers. It was still dark, but she got on her clothes and she ran downstairs. Mama, Mama, she cried, today's the day, isn't it? And her mother said, yes, Millie, get dressed. Today's the day. Today was the day of the Williamson County Fair. The Williamson County Fair, where farmers brought their animals and all their goods to show. And the best thing of all was that there were always lots of friends and relatives. It was the best day. It was better than Christmas. And today was even extra special because this year, the Williamson County Fair had invited the Young Buffalo Wild West show. And as part of that Young Buffalo Wild West show, she was going to get to see Annie Oakley. She had read about Annie Oakley, but she'd never seen her or seen a picture of her. She wanted to know more about Annie Oakley. Ready? Annie Oakley, she was Little Miss Sure Shot. Annie Oakley, she lived a life others just could not. Well, Millie and her mother made their way. They got dressed and they went down. They headed to go down to the train station. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. It was still dark. And Millie thought, we'll be the only ones there. No. According to the newspaper the next day in Marion, Illinois, there were thousands of people at the train station to watch them unload for the Young Buffalo Wild West show. It was amazing. They had all sorts of peoples in costumes, like people who looked like they were from Arabia and from Russia. They had cowboys. They had what they called Indians, what we would call Native Americans now, with their special regalia on. They had wild animals, lions and tigers and camels, a giraffe, and they had elephants too. It was so exciting. There was so much going on. And still, Millie was so excited she would get to see Annie Oakley. So who was Annie Oakley? Well, as we look back in history, we reframe, we better understand now that we know she shot a gun really well. She was a sharpshooter and a great performer. She entertained people all over the United States and even in Europe, the crowned heads of Europe. But now we've also come to understand Annie Oakley was the first woman, American, professional, which means that she did it for her living, athlete. We've never thought of Annie Oakley as an athlete. So how did she come about being such a great shooter? Well, let's talk about that. Annie was born in 1860, and apparently the first few years of her life lived a pretty good life with her mother and her sister and her brother and her father. And that changed when she was about 6 years old. It was a time, if you can imagine, a long time ago when people didn't have weather forecasts. They didn't know what the weather would be like in a day or two. They kind of guessed, but they didn't know. It was very late spring, and her father had gone on a trip, and there blew up, as sometimes does when you don't know what the weather's going to be. A very late spring blizzard, a horrible snowstorm. He was lost for several days in a snowstorm. By the time he came home, the cold had done such damage to him that he never fully recovered, and he passed away a few months later. Things changed a lot for Annie and her family at that point. There just wasn't enough money. There wasn't enough food, and her mother had to send her to an orphanage. Now, Annie stayed in the orphanage for about 6 years, but the people there were really mean to her, and when she was 12 years old, she ran away. She found her mother, and she moved back home with her mother, who had now remarried, and her sister and her brother. But there still really wasn't enough food. And at one point, Annie finally came across her own father's gun, hunting gun. She remembered she'd gone hunting with him some when she was little. She wondered if maybe she could shoot a gun and hunt some food for the family. So she took that gun out hunting, and she found out she was pretty good at hunting. She learned to hunt squirrels and deer. She learned to bring home rabbits. She even got good enough she could shoot birds like ducks and geese, so the family would have food to eat. She never liked killing animals, but the family was going to go hungry. And by the time, in fact, she was such a good shot that hotels in the area, especially in Cincinnati, recognized how good she was and how accurate she was, that they began asking her to supply some of the meat that they could serve and the game that they could serve their guests as meat. She got a reputation as a sharpshooter there in Darke County, Ohio, where she lived. And by the time she was 14, she had made enough money to help her mother and stepfather pay the mortgage off on their home. Wow. Now, a couple years later, when Annie was a teenager, about 1875, there's an Irish fellow named Frank Butler. Now, Frank Butler had come to the United States, and he, as a boy, to have a different life than what he had in Ireland. And he made his life living most of the time selling ammunition for guns. But sometimes he would go into a town and he would make a bet. He would say, I bet you $100, and he would put $100 down, say, I bet you $100 I can outshoot the sharpest sharpshooter in your county. And so occasionally, most of the time he won because he was so good. So he was in Darke County, Ohio on his rounds as an ammunition salesman, and he went in and he made that same boast right there on the main street. He said, I bet $100 that I can outshoot the best shooter in Darke County, Ohio. Well, there was a hotel owner there who was very familiar with Annie Oakley's shooting. And he said, well, you are on. I'll take you up on that bet. You just tell me, well, let's agree when we're going to meet and where. So they agreed to meet the next day. And the hotel owner said, I will bring our best sharpshooter. So the next day out on an open meadow where they had arranged to meet, and Frank Butler was warming up and chatting with the hotel owner when he saw a wagon drive up. And out of that wagon stepped a slender teenage girl. Frank looked at the hotel owner and he said, "Who's that?" And the hotel owner said, "Frank, that is your competition." Well, Frank thought it was a joke that that a little girl like that was gonna outshoot him. He threw back his head and laughed. Oh, this is gonna be easy. Well, they lined up and they got all ready for the shooting contest. Now, in those days, when it was time to release the target to fly into the sky, the person who was ready to shoot would say, "Pull." So Frank started out, and he said in that voice of his, he said, "Pull," and the target flew up. Frank lifted his gun, and bam, he brought it down right out of the sky. And it was Annie's turn, and her little light voice, "Pull." Target flew up, bam. She hit it, easy as pie. So Frank went again. "Pull." Target flew up, bam. He hit it. It was Annie's turn. "Pull." Target goes up, bam. Well, I'm here to tell you, Frank Butler hit that target that flew up 25 times in a row. Annie Oakley hit her targets. I'm sorry, Frank hit it 24 times in a row. And so did Annie Oakley, 24 times. So on the 25th time, Frank Butler hollered, "Pull," bam. Frank Butler had missed. Now it was Annie's turn. If she hit the next shot, she would win the match. She took a deep breath and she steadied herself and her gun as she always did, and she hollered, "Pull." Target flew up, bam. She hit it dead on. Well, Frank Butler not only lost the contest that day, truth be told, he lost his heart. He fell head over heels in love with that little teenage girl. And a few years later, they were married. And they were married for many, many years. In fact, when Annie finally passed away, Frank died within 3 weeks after she did. Some say maybe it was because of a broken heart. Ready? Annie Oakley. She was Little Miss Sure Shot. Annie Oakley. She lived a life that others just could not. Well, they were married, and Frank and Annie traveled the country with a lot of traveling shows, and finally they spent a number of years with Wild Bill Cody in the Wild West. And they traveled all over, including places in Europe, and performed in front of kings and queens. And Annie was amazing with the kind of tricks that she could do. You know the kinds of things that she could do? Well, first, usually the music would start and Annie would sort of skip into the ring, and then she would leap onto the back of a horse that was trotting around the ring. She would stand up on the horse with her gun, and she would shoot targets as she rode that horse standing around the ring. Another part of the show, Frank would have glass balls he would throw up in the air one after the other. And bam, she would bring down every single ball with amazing accuracy. There was a circle that was made so that you could spin it around, and it had lit candles on it. Annie would shoot the flames off the candles. Annie could even, if Frank tossed a dime up into the air, she would shoot it down. It was amazing the things that she would do. If you took a playing card and threw it up in the air, Frank would throw it up in the air, and there would be a hole shot through that playing card right where the face was of the king or the queen. It was amazing, the accuracy. Two of the favorite tricks though that she did. One was where she would have a mirror and she would hold her gun and she would look over her shoulder at the target and shoot it. She would even shoot the tip of a cigarette while Frank was holding it in his mouth. In fact, when she was in Europe and performed in front of Wilhelm Kaiser III, head of Germany, who was ruler of Germany at that time, he volunteered. He put his lit cigarette in his mouth and she shot the ash off the tip of that cigarette. It was amazing. Athletic balance, eye-hand coordination, endurance and strength, steadiness and confidence. Yes, she was an athlete. She was amazing, the things that she did. Annie Oakley, she was Little Miss Sure Shot. Annie Oakley, she lived a life that others just could not. Well, Annie and Frank traveled around the country for a lot of years. And in 1901, she had another challenge in her life. She was in a horrible train wreck. People thought she might not walk again, and for sure that she'd never perform or shoot a gun. But Annie proved them wrong. They just didn't know Annie Oakley. She worked hard. They never traveled again with the Wild Buffalo, with the Wild West show, with that show, but they did some more traveling later. And there was another battle she had. In 1903, there was a woman who was arrested as a robber, and she was thrown in jail. She said she was Annie Oakley. And there was a newspaper man named William Hearst. He was the most powerful newspaper man in the country, and he published in papers that went all over the country that Annie Oakley had been arrested as a thief. Now, William Randolph Hearst didn't understand that for Annie Oakley, her reputation, her honesty was one of the things she valued the most, and she took him to court. That court case lasted 6 years, and she demanded that he pay her for the damage he had done to her good name. 6 years later, she won. William Randolph Hearst paid the largest liability payment that had been made up to that point in American history, which was $27,000. But Annie had made her point because she was Annie Oakley. Annie Oakley, she was Little Miss Sure Shot. Annie Oakley, she lived a life that others just could not. So back to our story with Millie. Millie and her mother were watching the train be unloaded on this day in 1913 in Marion, Illinois. And there was so much hustle and bustle and people. But you know, Millie noticed a little kitten over by one of the tents, and she was afraid it would get stepped on, and she went and picked it up and held it, and she started looking around for its owner, and finally she did find the little girl who said, "Oh, that's my kitten," and she gave it to her, and by the time she looked up, she lost her mother. Millie was lost in this crush of people. She didn't know what to do. She walked up and down. She went by the fairway. She looked, walked by the tent. She still couldn't, close to the railroad track, she couldn't find her mother. She was so upset, she began to cry. And then she looked up, and there was a woman there, not a very tall woman, who had a big, broad hat and a kerchief around her neck. And the woman said, "Are you okay?" Millie shook her head and said, "No, I'm lost. I lost my mom." Well, let's see if we can find her. So the woman, her hands were gloved. She took her by the hand, and they walked around for a little while, and finally the crowds parted, and there was Millie's mom looking very panicked. Oh, Millie was reunited with her mother, and the woman gave her 2 playing cards that had holes in them, like bullet holes, and said, "Here, if you get this to the ticket master, show this to the ticket master, and you won't have to pay to get into the show this afternoon." "Thank you," said Millie, and the woman left. Well, Millie and her mother watched and enjoyed so much of the show they watched acrobats, and they watched a stagecoach, and they watched cowboys, and they saw elephants, all those sorts of things. And finally, at the end of the show, what she'd been waiting for, they announced Annie Oakley was going to come on and shoot. And a woman walked out into the ring, and it was a woman wearing a broad hat, and she wore a handkerchief. Mama, said Millie, that was Annie Oakley that helped me. Yes, it was, said her mother. And they watched. Annie did all of her favorite tricks. Frank threw the balls up in the air. She shot the cigarette out of his teeth. She snuffed out candles as they burned. She shot a dime out of his fingers. It was amazing. And she even did that favorite trick where she held the gun and used a mirror to shoot what was behind her. A day like no other for Millie. She would remember that her whole life. And the ticket master had let them keep the cards. She had those cards. She kept it. And it inspired Millie to think about maybe she could do something physical for fun. Maybe she could be an athlete, be strong, be confident, even though she was a girl. Maybe she could. She looked at that card and thought about it. Maybe her daughter could. Maybe her granddaughter could. Maybe her great granddaughter could. Yes, Annie Oakley was the first American female professional athlete. Where I grew up, in the town I grew up in, there wasn't really money for girls to be in athletics. Millie's about the age that my grandmother was. And it would be her great-great-grandchild who finally had the opportunity. Title IX, so that girls would have funding for athletics and women would have funding for athletics. Came too late for some of us to really participate in sports, but our daughters and our granddaughters can. Annie Oakley always encouraged women to be active and athletic. And Millie held on to that card the rest of her life. Annie Oakley, she was Little Miss Sure Shot. Annie Oakley, she lived a life that others just could not. Annie Oakley, she lived a life that others just could not. Annie Oakley, she lived a life that others just could not. She was a sure shot, first woman American professional athlete, Annie Oakley. Thanks so much, and this is the end of my show. Thanks so much, Jacksonville Public Library, and we've got a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, they can ask on chat, and they can share with me. If you don't, that's fine. All right. How long have I been storytelling? Oh, gee, I'd say that's kind of a loaded question, but maybe 30 years at least. I did start storytelling some way back, 40 years ago, but didn't really start doing it professionally, probably for about 30 years or so. Thanks. Anything else? All righty, then we'll call it a show. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and those of you who are watching it later, hope you enjoy the show, and we appreciate you so much. Hope you enjoyed the story of the Army of Two, and little girls in Scituate, Massachusetts, and the story of Annie Oakley, Little Miss Sure Shot. Thanks everybody.